The scream that tore through the pre-dawn stillness of Blackwood Asylum wasn't human. Not entirely. It was a raw, guttural shriek that seemed to claw its way up from the very bedrock beneath the institution's crumbling foundations, vibrating the leaded glass in the high, barred windows and silencing the frantic chirping of the sparrows nesting in the eaves. It wasn't the familiar, despairing wail of a lunatic lost in the labyrinth of their own mind, nor the choked sob of a soul broken by the relentless regimen of cold baths and straitjackets. This was something else, primal, terrifying. It carried an impossible weight, a resonance that bypassed the ears and hammered directly against the sternum, leaving the night watchman, old Silas Griggs, frozen mid-stride on the stone-flagged corridor, his oil lamp trembling violently in his gnarled hand, casting monstrous, leaping shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. His blood, usually sluggish with cheap gin and decades of institutional apathy, turned to ice water. He knew that sound. He'd heard it once before, 17 years ago, on a night thick with unnatural fog and the stench of ozone, the night the Caldwell boy was born. And now, 17 years later, it was back. Silas didn't need to check the ledger. He knew precisely which cell it came from. Cell 7. Timothy Caldwell's cell. The boy science couldn't explain. The boy who shouldn't exist. And as the scream abruptly cut off, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the world itself was holding its breath, Silas Griggs knew, with a certainty that chilled him deeper than any winter wind, that whatever fragile dam had been holding back the impossible within that cell had finally, catastrophically, burst. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here. Wait, before we go any deeper into this mystery, I need to ask you something. If you're as captivated by Timothy's story as I am, if your heart's racing, your mind spinning with questions about what really happened in Blackwater Fun, then do me a quick favor. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell. I'm committed to bringing you more true historical mysteries that textbooks ignore and science can't explain. But I can't do it without you. Every subscribe tells YouTube this matters. And while you're at it, comment below where in the world you are watching from. Alright, back to our story. Because what happened after Timothy vanished? That's where things get even stranger. The year was 1850. Blackwood wasn't yet the asylum it would become. It was Blackwood Manor, a sprawling Gothic pile of weathered stone perched precariously on the edge of the treacherous Blackwood marshes, owned by the reclusive and increasingly unstable industrialist, Alastair Caldwell. Alastair, a man whose fortune was built on ruthless efficiency and a mind that saw the world as a complex machine to be mastered, had retreated here with his young, fragile wife, Eleanor, seeking solace from the pressures of his empire and the whispers about his own deteriorating sanity. Eleanor, pale as moonlight and prone to nervous tremors, carried their first and only child. The pregnancy had been difficult, shadowed by Alastair's obsessive anxieties and the oppressive isolation of the manor, its windows perpetually shuttered against the damp, clinging mists that rolled in from the marshes like spectral fingers. The night Timothy was born was unlike any recorded in the parish annals. A storm of impossible ferocity descended upon Blackwood, not with rain, but with a thick, cloying fog that swallowed sound and light, turning the world into a suffocating gray void. Lightning didn't fork across the sky. It pulsed, a sickly, greenish luminescence that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, illuminating the skeletal trees in brief, ghastly flashes. The air crackled with static, making hair stand on end and causing the brass fittings on the manor doors to spark. Dr. Eris Thorne, the local physician summoned in haste, arrived soaked and shaken, his horse spooked into near hysteria by the unnatural atmosphere. He found Alastair pacing the grand hall like a caged predator, muttering about cosmic alignments and resonant frequencies. His eyes fever-bright. Eleanor's labor was agonizing, prolonged, and punctuated by moments of terrifying stillness. Thorne, a man of staunch Victorian rationality, found his medical texts woefully inadequate. The contractions didn't follow any known pattern. They seemed to surge and recede with the pulsing green light outside. Eleanor's cries were interspersed with gasps that sounded less like pain and more like inhalation of something vast and alien. Then, as the clock in the hall struck the witching hour, a final, blinding pulse of green light filled the birthing chamber, accompanied by a low, subsonic hum that vibrated the very marrow in Thorne's bones. In that impossible instant, Timothy Caldwell was born. He didn't cry. Not at first. He simply opened his eyes that were not the expected slate gray of a newborn, but a startling, deep violet, almost black, yet holding within them a faint, internal luminescence, like distant stars seen through a telescope. And then he screamed, not the thin, reedy wail of an infant, but a sound that ripped through the storm's unnatural silence. The same guttural, earth-shaking shriek that would echo 17 years later in the asylum corridors. The green light flared one last time, then vanished, plunging the room into near darkness, broken only by the guttering candles. The storm abated as suddenly as it began, leaving behind an eerie calm and the pervasive smell of ozone and damp earth. Dr. Thorne, hands trembling as he cleaned the infant, felt a profound disquiet. Timothy was physically perfect, yet wrong. His skin was cool to the touch, unnaturally so. His tiny fingers, when they brushed Thorne's wrist, sent a jolt of static electricity up his arm. And those eyes, they seemed to see too much, holding an ancient, unsettling awareness that no newborn should possess. Alistair, however, was ecstatic. He saw not a monster, but a miracle, a culmination of his theories about harnessing unseen energies, about transcending the limitations of mere flesh. He named the boy Timothy, meaning honoring God, though his own reverence was directed not towards the divine, but towards the raw, untamed power he believed his son embodied. Eleanor, exhausted and terrified by the ordeal and her husband's fervent, almost fanatical pronouncements, faded rapidly in the weeks that followed. She developed a wasting sickness the local doctors couldn't name. Her vitality seemingly leached away. She would stare at Timothy in his cradle, not with maternal love, but with a profound, haunted dread, whispering to Thorne, "He takes it, doctor. He takes the light." She died 3 months after Timothy's birth, her body frail as dried parchment, her eyes vacant. Alistair buried her in the family plot overlooking the marshes, his grief quickly subsumed by his obsession with his son. He dismissed the staff, isolating himself and Timothy within the decaying grandeur of Blackwood Manor, dedicating himself to understanding and ultimately controlling the phenomenon his son represented. 17 years later, Blackwood Manor was Blackwood Asylum. Alistair Caldwell's descent into madness, fueled by his experiments on his own son and his inability to fully comprehend or harness Timothy's nature, had become too public, too dangerous. Whispers of strange lights, unnatural sounds, and Alistair's increasingly erratic behavior reached the ears of the county magistrates. A forced intervention saw Alistair declared unfit, confined to a padded cell in the very institution his home had become, and Timothy, deemed a danger to himself and others due to his uncontrollable episodes, placed in Cell 7, the most secure, isolated cell in the asylum's east wing, lined with thick lead sheeting Alistair himself had insisted upon during his lucid moments, claiming it dampened resonant frequencies. Timothy Caldwell, at 17, was a study in unsettling contradictions. He possessed a delicate, almost ethereal beauty, high cheekbones, pale skin that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, and that same deep violet eyes that held galaxies of unspoken knowledge. He was unervingly still, moving with a silent grace that made no sound on the stone floor. He rarely spoke, his voice, when used, a soft, melodic whisper that seemed to resonate in the listener's bones rather than their ears. He ate little, drank less, and spent most of his time sitting cross-legged on the thin straw pallet, staring at the lead-lined walls as if reading secrets written in the metal itself. The asylum staff, hardened by years of dealing with the mentally ill, treated him with a mixture of superstitious fear and clinical detachment. They called him the Ghost Boy or Caldwell's Folly. Only old Silas Griggs, who had been the manor's groundskeeper before its conversion, remembered the birth, remembered Eleanor's fear, and treated Timothy with a wary, silent respect. Dr. Eris Thorne, now the asylum's chief physician, was Timothy's primary observer. The rationalist in him warred constantly with the evidence of his own senses. He documented everything meticulously in his leather-bound journal. Timothy's abnormally low body temperature, consistently 92 degrees Fahrenheit. His lack of measurable brainwave activity on the primitive electroencephalograph Thorne had jury-rigged, showing only flat lines or chaotic, non-biological spikes. His ability to seemingly sense events before they happened, he would flinch seconds before a door slammed elsewhere in the asylum, and the strange, localized atmospheric disturbances that occurred around him, sudden drops in temperature, static discharges that made hair stand on end, and the faint, ozone-tinged scent that clung to his cell. Thorne's most disturbing observation, however, was the effect Timothy had on others. Prolonged exposure, even through the thick glass peephole in his cell door, induced profound unease, headaches, and vivid, disturbing nightmares in the staff. One orderly, young Billy Cobb, had lasted only a week on Cell 7 duty before resigning, claiming Timothy's eyes sucked the warmth right out of your soul. Thorne himself felt it, a deep, instinctive chill, a sense of being scrutinized by something fundamentally other. Yet, his scientific curiosity, the same drive that had brought him to Blackwood Manor on that stormy night, refused to let him dismiss Timothy as merely insane. There was a pattern, a logic, however alien, beneath the surface. He just couldn't grasp it. His attempts at communication were met with silence or those unnerving, star-filled eyes. Thorne tried music. Timothy would tilt his head, listening intently, but showed no emotional response. He tried books. Timothy would sometimes trace the letters with a cool finger, but never read aloud or indicated comprehension. He tried simple questions. "Timothy, how do you feel?" The boy would simply stare, his expression unreadable, until Thorne felt foolish and retreated. The only time Timothy showed any reaction was during thunderstorms. He would stand by the small, barred window, his face turned towards the sky, his violet eyes reflecting the lightning flashes, a faint, almost imperceptible hum emanating from him, harmonizing with the thunder. It was during one such storm, a week before the scream that opened our story, that Thorne witnessed something that shattered his remaining scientific certainties. He was making his nightly rounds, the storm raging outside, when he passed Cell 7. Instead of standing at the window, Timothy was sitting in the center of the cell, cross-legged. The air around him shimmered, like heat haze off a desert road, but the cell was cold. And then, for a fraction of a second, Thorne saw it. Timothy's form seemed to flicker, not like a candle flame, but like a poorly tuned image, momentarily resolving into something else. Something tall, slender, composed of shifting, iridescent light, with eyes like twin nebulae. Then it was gone, and Timothy was just a pale boy sitting on the floor, looking up at Thorne with those deep violet eyes, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek, a tear that, Thorne later noted with clinical horror, left a faint, phosphorescent trail on Timothy's skin before evaporating. Thorne stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs, the rational world he knew cracking like thin ice. "What are you?" The question echoed in his mind, louder than the thunder. "What have you brought into this world, Alistair?" The scream that shattered the pre-dawn silence wasn't born of madness, but of unbearable pressure. For 17 years, Timothy had existed as a vessel, a conduit for something vast and ancient that had bled into this reality on the night of his birth, anchored by the unique confluence of cosmic energies Alistair had unwittingly tapped into. His mother's life force, her very essence, had been the initial tether, the sacrifice that stabilized the connection. Her death had weakened it, but Alistair's subsequent experiments, crude attempts to measure, channel, and control the energy flowing through his son, had acted like crude sutures, painful and imperfect, but holding the breach closed. Now, confined in the lead-lined cell, isolated, observed, and prodded by Thorne's relentless, if well-intentioned scrutiny, the sutures were fraying. The pressure from the other side was building, a tidal wave of non-Euclidean geometry and alien consciousness straining against the fragile membrane of Timothy's human form. The scream was the sound of that membrane tearing. It wasn't just sound, it was a physical force. The thick lead lining on the walls of Cell 7 groaned, buckling inward in places. The heavy oak door, reinforced with iron bands, vibrated on its hinges. Dust rained from the ceiling. Outside, in the corridor, Silas Griggs dropped his lamp. The glass shattered, the oil spreading, but the flame guttered and died instantly, as if smothered by an invisible hand. The silence that followed the scream wasn't empty. It was charged. It hummed with potential energy, thick and heavy as tar. Inside cell 7, Timothy lay curled on the floor, trembling violently. His skin was almost translucent, revealing a tracery of faint, pulsing violet light beneath the surface, like veins filled with liquid starlight. His eyes were wide open, but the violet was gone, replaced by a swirling, chaotic maelstrom of colors that defied description, colors that hurt to look at, that seemed to shift the very perception of space around them. He wasn't breathing, or rather, his chest wasn't rising and falling in the human rhythm. Instead, the air around him seemed to pulse, flowing in and out in complex, geometric patterns. He was losing coherence. The human anchor was failing. The disturbance didn't go unnoticed. Alarms, primitive but effective bells connected to pressure plates and tripwires Thorne had installed out of paranoia, began to clang throughout the East Wing. Doors slammed open as night staff, roused from uneasy sleep, stumbled into the corridor, their faces pale with fear. They clustered at the end of the hall, keeping a wide berth from cell 7, their eyes wide with terror. They'd heard the scream. They felt the unnatural cold radiating from the cell. They saw the way the shadows seemed to writhe and deepen near the door. Dr. Thorne arrived moments later, hastily buttoning his waistcoat, his face grim. He pushed through the frightened staff, his medical bag clutched tightly. He peered through the reinforced glass peephole. What he saw stopped him cold. Timothy wasn't just convulsing. His form was unstable. One moment he was the pale boy, the next, his outline would blur, elongating, becoming insubstantial, revealing glimpses of that impossible, luminous entity Thorne had seen flickering weeks before. The air inside the cell shimmered violently, and the temperature, even through the thick glass, felt like the heart of a glacier. Thorne's breath fogged instantly. "Griggs!" Thorne barked, his voice tight with controlled panic. The heavy restraints, and the sedative, the full dose of laudanum mixed with bromide. "Now!" Silas, his face ashen but his movements steady from decades of service, nodded and hurried away. Thorne knew the restraints, thick leather straps lined with lead mesh, were unlikely to hold whatever was happening. But it was protocol, a desperate attempt to impose human order on the chaos. He pressed his ear to the cold metal of the door. Beneath the oppressive silence, he could hear it. A low, complex thrumming, like the combined hum of 1,000 tuning forks resonating at impossible frequencies. It vibrated his teeth. It made his vision blur at the edges. Silas returned, struggling with the heavy restraint kit and a large syringe filled with a murky brown liquid. Two burly orderlies, their faces masks of fear, flanked him, gripping iron pokers more for their own courage than any real utility against what lay within. Thorne took a deep breath, the ozone smell sharp in his nostrils. "On my count, open the door just enough for the restraints and the syringe. Do not look directly at him. Do not step inside." "Understood." The orderlies nodded mutely, their knuckles white on the pokers. Silas hefted the restraint kit, his old eyes fixed on the door handle with grim determination. Thorne positioned himself, syringe ready. 1, 2. He turned the heavy key in the lock. The mechanism groaned in protest, as if resisting. He pulled the door open just a crack 6 inches. No more. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A wave of pure cold, so intense it felt like physical blows, slammed into them, stealing their breath. The thrumming sound became a physical pressure, pushing against their chests. And the light, a blinding, actinic violet radiance erupted from the gap, not illuminating, but consuming the weak lamplight in the corridor, casting everything in stark, impossible shadows that moved independently of their sources. Through the narrow opening, Thorne saw Timothy, or what was left of him. He was floating a foot above the floor, limbs outstretched, his body a nexus of swirling, chaotic energy. His eyes were pure, swirling voids of color. He wasn't looking at them. His gaze seemed fixed on some point infinitely far away, or perhaps on a dimension folded within the cell itself. The air around him crackled with visible arcs of violet electricity. "Now!" Thorn yelled, thrusting the syringe through the gap. But Timothy's head snapped towards the opening. Those impossible eyes locked onto Thorn's. Not with malice, but with a profound, alien sorrow that cut deeper than any threat. And in that instant, Thorn understood. Not the mechanics, not the science, but the essence. Timothy wasn't a monster. He was a prisoner, trapped between worlds, torn apart by the very existence he was forced to maintain. The scream wasn't rage. It was agony. The instability wasn't madness. It was dissolution. Before Thorn could react, before the orderlies could move, Timothy raised a hand, or the energy coalescing around the shape of a hand, towards the door. There was no blast, no explosion. There was simply a rearrangement. The heavy oak door, the iron bands, the lead lining, they didn't break. They unfolded, like origami crafted by a mad god. The solid matter of the door twisted, bent, and flowed inwards, creating a smooth, seamless archway where the door had been. The restraints and syringe clattered to the floor, forgotten. Timothy floated through the archway, silent, radiating that terrible cold and light. The staff scattered like frightened rabbits, screaming, tripping over each other in their haste to escape. Silas stood his ground, rooted by a lifetime of loyalty and a deeper, older fear, his eyes wide but unblinking. Thorn stood frozen, not by fear, but by the sheer, overwhelming wrongness of the physics being violated before his eyes, and by the crushing weight of that sorrowful gaze. Timothy didn't look at them. He floated down the corridor, his bare feet not touching the stone floor, leaving faint, phosphorescent footprints that faded after a few seconds. The air crackled and hummed in his wake. He turned a corner, heading not towards the main entrance, but deeper into the asylum, towards the old West Wing, the part that had once been Alistair Caldwell's private study and laboratory, the heart of his obsessive experiments. Thorn, shaking off his paralysis, grabbed Silas's arm. "He's going to the lab. Come on." He didn't know why, but he knew he had to follow. This wasn't an escape. It was a homecoming, or a reckoning. The West Wing was a time capsule of Alistair Caldwell's descent. Dust lay thick on abandoned equipment. Brass astrolabes fused with strange, non-terrestrial crystals. Glass vacuum tubes filled with swirling, iridescent gases that shouldn't exist. Intricate clockwork mechanisms designed to measure etheric currents or psychic resonance. And shelves lined with journals filled with increasingly frantic, manic scrawls about harmonic convergence, dimensional bleeding, and the key. The air here was thick with the smell of ozone, old chemicals, and decay. Moonlight, weak and filtered through grimy windows, cast long, distorted shadows. Timothy floated into the center of the main laboratory, the largest room. He hovered before a massive, complex device dominating the far wall, Alistair's magnum opus, his resonance harmonizer. It was a nightmare of brass coils, humming vacuum tubes, rotating crystal lenses, and banks of flickering dials, all connected by a web of copper wires that snaked across the floor and ceiling. At its heart, mounted on a lead pedestal, was a large, multifaceted crystal that pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, the same color as the storm on Timothy's birth night. Alistair had believed this device could stabilize Timothy, could tune his frequency to this reality, making him controllable, usable. Timothy reached out a hand towards the harmonizer. The green light within the central crystal flared violently, responding to his proximity. The hum of the device, dormant for years, surged to life, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated the floorboards. Dials spun wildly. Arcs of green and violet electricity danced between the coils. The air pressure dropped, making Thorn's ears pop. "Timothy, no!" Thorn cried, stumbling into the room, Silas close behind, his face grim. "It's unstable. It'll tear you apart." Timothy turned his head slowly. The swirling chaos in his eyes had lessened slightly, replaced by a profound weariness, but the alien sorrow remained. He didn't speak, But Thorn felt the words form in his own mind, clear as a bell yet resonant with that same bone-deep hum. "It is already torn, Doctor. The anchor is gone." The tether phrase. This a machine. It was never a solution. It was a cage within a cage. Thorn reeled. Telepathy? Or was his own mind simply resonating with Timothy's fractured state? "Your mother, Eleanor. She was the anchor. She was the bridge. Her life, her love. It held the door open just enough for me to be here. But her light was consumed. Father's machine. It tried to replace her with cold metal and false harmonies. It only made the tear wider." Timothy's form flickered again, the luminous entity becoming more distinct for a terrifying second. "The pressure from the other side. It grows. I cannot hold the shape much longer." The scream. It was the sound of the vessel cracking. Alistair Caldwell, drawn by the commotion and the reactivation of his beloved machine, shuffled into the doorway. He was a broken man, dressed in a stained asylum gown, his hair wild, his eyes darting with residual mania, but a flicker of his old intensity returned as he saw the harmonizer active and his son before it. "Timothy!" he rasped, his voice cracking. "You've come. You understand. The harmonizer. It's ready. We can stabilize the resonance. We can control it. Harness the power. Become more than human." He took a step forward, his hands outstretched towards the machine, not his son. Timothy's gaze shifted to his father. The sorrow in his eyes deepened, mixed now with a profound pity. "You never saw me, Father. Only the power. Only the key to your ambitions. You built cages of lead and brass, but the greatest cage was your own mind." Alistair's face contorted with rage and denial. "Foolish boy. You don't understand. This is your destiny. To be the conduit. To bring the future." He lunged past Thorn and Silas, heading straight for the control panel of the harmonizer. "Stop him!" Thorn yelled, but Silas was already moving, his old body surprisingly quick. He grabbed Alistair's arm, but the madman, fueled by desperate obsession, threw him off with surprising strength. Silas stumbled back, hitting the stone wall with a sickening thud and sliding to the floor, unconscious. Alistair reached the control panel. His fingers, trembling with excitement, flew over the dials and levers. Just a little more power. Tune the frequency to his core resonance. We'll lock it in. Forever. He threw a large, brass switch. The harmonizer screamed. Not a mechanical whine, but a shriek of tortured energy. The green light in the central crystal exploded outwards, bathing the room in an intense, nauseating glare. The thrumming became a physical assault, shaking the very foundations of the asylum. Cracks spiderwebbed across the stone walls. Glass tubes shattered, spraying iridescent fluid. The copper wires glowed white-hot. Timothy cried out, a sound of pure agony that echoed the pre-dawn scream, but laced with betrayal. His form destabilized completely. He wasn't floating anymore. He was unraveling. Tendrils of violet light streamed from his body, lashing out like whips, striking the walls, the floor, the harmonizer itself. Where they touched, reality seemed to warp, stone flowed like liquid. Would grain reverse direction? Shadows peeled away from surfaces and writhed independently. Alistair stood transfixed before the maelstrom, his face a mask of ecstatic horror. Yes, the power. It's glorious. He reached out a hand towards the dissolving form of his son, towards the raw energy. One of the violet tendrils lashed out, wrapping around Alistair's outstretched arm. There was no burn, no physical mark, but Alistair's eyes widened in sudden, absolute terror. His body stiffened, his mouth opened in a silent scream, and then he simply unfolded, like the door, but infinitely more complex and horrifying. His flesh, his bones, his very being, seemed to lose cohesion, flattening, stretching, and dissolving into a two-dimensional pattern of impossible geometry that hung in the air for a second before vanishing with a soft pop, leaving only the faint smell of ozone and a single, scorched asylum slipper on the floor. Thorne stared, his mind refusing to process what he'd just witnessed. Erasure. Not death. Unmaking. He looked at Timothy, or what remained. The boy was barely recognizable. A core of swirling violet light surrounded by chaotic energy. The harmonizer feeding the storm. Its green light now a sickly yellow. The pressure in the room was unbearable. A physical weight threatening to crush Thorne's ribs. He knew, with chilling certainty, that if this continued, the tear would widen. Not just Timothy would be lost. The instability could cascade, unraveling the fabric of reality in this place, perhaps beyond. The asylum, the town, the very world. It could all become a footnote in a cosmic accident. He had to stop the machine. But how? The controls were fused. The dials melted. The energy arcing from it was lethal. He looked at Silas, stirring groggily on the floor. He looked at the dissolving core of light that was Timothy. And he remembered Eleanor's whisper. He takes the light. An idea born of desperation and a dawning, terrible understanding struck him. The harmonizer wasn't just amplifying Timothy's energy. It was feeding on it, creating a feedback loop. To break the loop, you needed to disrupt the resonance. Not with more power, but with silence. With an absence. With the one thing Timothy seemed to lack. The one thing his mother had provided. A stable human anchor. A connection to this world. Thorne didn't hesitate. Ignoring the searing heat radiating from the machine. Ignoring the warping reality around him. He ran towards the vortex of light that was Timothy. He didn't try to grab him. He knew physical contact might be catastrophic. Instead, he stopped a few feet away, directly in Timothy's line of sight, or what passed for sight in that swirling maelstrom. "Timothy!" Thorne shouted over the roar of the harmonizer and the thrumming void. "Look at me. Remember. Remember the manor. Remember the marshes. Remember your mother's face. Remember me, Dr. Thorne, the man who tried to understand." He poured every ounce of his own humanity, his fear, his compassion, his desperate hope, into his voice, into his gaze. He wasn't trying to control Timothy. He was offering himself as a tether, a fragile human anchor in the storm. For a moment, nothing happened. The vortex churned. The harmonizer screamed. Then, the swirling chaos in the core of light stilled. The violet tendrils retracted slightly. The maelstrom focused. Those impossible eyes, now clearer, more Timothy than alien, locked onto Thorne's. The bone-deep hum softened, becoming a questioning thrum. "Doctor?" The thought voice was faint, strained, but undeniably Timothy. "Yes, it's me. Hold on, Timothy. Hold on to this. Hold on to me." Thorne held his ground, his own body trembling, sweat stinging his eyes, but his gaze unwavering. He projected images in his mind. The quiet study in the manor before the madness, the smell of Eleanor's lavender sachets, the feel of cool stone on a summer day, the simple human act of sharing a cup of tea. Mundane, precious anchors to a reality Timothy was slipping away from. The feedback loop faltered. The harmonizer's scream dropped in pitch, becoming a pained whine. The green-yellow light flickered. The warping of the room slowed, the shadows settling back onto the walls. The crushing pressure lessened, just enough to draw a ragged breath. Timothy's form began to coalesce. The swirling light condensed, pulling back into the familiar, pale shape of the boy. The violet eyes, though still deep and strange, held a human awareness, filled with exhaustion and a dawning horror at what had happened, at his father's unmaking, at the destruction around him. He floated lower, his feet touching the floor. The intense cold radiating from him diminished to its usual unnerving chill. The harmonizer gave one final, shuddering groan and fell silent. The central crystal darkened, cracked down the middle. Smoke curled from its base. The only light in the ruined laboratory came from the weak moonlight and the faint, residual phosphorescence clinging to Timothy's skin. He looked at Thorne, then at the spot where his father had stood, then at the unconscious Silas. A single, luminous tear traced its path down his cheek. The tear didn't evaporate this time. It fell to the scorched floorboards and sizzled faintly, leaving a tiny, dark mark. "It's quiet now," Timothy whispered, his actual voice a dry rustle, and used for so long. He swayed on his feet, the immense effort of pulling himself back from the brink leaving him drained, fragile as spun glass. Thorn rushed forward, catching him before he collapsed. Timothy was light, almost insubstantial, his skin cool but no longer icy. He leaned into Thorn's support, his head resting against the doctor's shoulder, his breathing shallow but steady. The alien sorrow was still there, but overlaid now with a profound human grief. Silas groaned, pushing himself up, wincing as he touched the lump on his head. He saw Timothy in Thorn's arms, saw the ruined laboratory, saw the single slipper. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded slowly, his old eyes filled with a weary understanding. He knew the cost. He'd seen it begin. The aftermath was a tapestry of silence and secrets. The official report, meticulously crafted by Dr. Thorne and reluctantly signed off by the asylum's nervous board of governors, spoke of a catastrophic gas explosion in the disused West Wing laboratory, caused by Alistair Caldwell's tampering with volatile chemicals during a psychotic episode. Alistair was listed as deceased, victim of the blast. The extensive structural damage and the unfortunate incident involving the night staff, who were quietly paid off and sworn to secrecy, were attributed to the explosion's force. Timothy Caldwell, found unconscious but unharmed in the rubble, was deemed to have suffered a severe shock-induced catatonia. His transfer to a specialized secure facility in Switzerland was arranged with unseemly haste, funded by the remnants of the Caldwell fortune, now under Thorne's discreet trusteeship. Blackwood Asylum closed its doors within the year, the damage too extensive, the reputation too tarnished. The marshes reclaimed the grounds, swallowing the crumbling manor-turned asylum into their damp, green embrace. Silas Griggs, refusing any pension, simply vanished one night, his small cottage found empty, his few belongings gone. Some said he walked into the marshes, seeking the quiet he'd known before the storm. Others whispered he went to watch over the boy, wherever he was taken. Thorne never saw Timothy again. The Swiss facility was a fiction, a paper trail leading nowhere. Thorne knew the truth. Timothy couldn't be contained by any asylum, any lead-line cell, any machine. He was a walking paradox, a breach in reality that needed not confinement but management, understanding. Thorne used the Caldwell funds to establish a discreet network, a handful of trusted individuals, a retired physicist fascinated by the edges of known science, a nun with a quiet faith that accepted mysteries, a naturalist who understood the uncanny patterns of the natural world, to watch over Timothy, to provide him with safe havens, to help him navigate the fragile boundary between his nature and the human world. Timothy, Thorne learned through coded letters, lived a nomadic existence, always on the move, always careful, always carrying the weight of his difference and the memory of his father's ambition and his mother's sacrifice. Thorne spent the rest of his life haunted, not by fear, but by the profound, unanswerable questions Timothy represented. He filled volumes of journals, not with clinical observations, but with philosophical treatises, desperate attempts to reconcile the impossible with the rational. He studied ancient texts on cosmic horror, quantum theory, in its infancy, and mystical traditions, searching for a framework, a language, to describe what he had witnessed. He never found one. Science, for all its power, had no lexicon for a boy who was a doorway. It could measure the cold, the static, the anomalous brainwaves, but it could not explain the why, the how, or the crushing weight of that alien sorrow in violet eyes. He often stood on the cliffs overlooking the sea near his retirement cottage, watching the horizon where sky met water in an endless, shifting line. He thought of Timothy, somewhere out there in the vast, indifferent world, a solitary figure holding back an ocean of chaos with nothing but his fragile human will and the memory of a doctor's desperate offer of connection. Was he a mistake? A cosmic accident? Or was he something else entirely? A scout? A seed? A necessary fracture in the mundane to remind humanity that the universe was far stranger, far more terrifying, and far more wondrous than their equations could ever encompass? Years turned into decades. Blackwood slowly faded, its young people drawn to the cities, the old ways dying with the old folk. The Caldwell cottage collapsed, reclaimed by the relentless fun. The story of Timothy Caldwell became a local legend, a footnote in the annals of Adirondack folklore, mentioned in obscure journals on regional superstitions alongside tales of the Beast of Gavaudan or the Jersey Devil, curious, unverified, ultimately dismissed as products of ignorance and isolation. Science marched on, conquering new frontiers, explaining the heavens and the atom, seemingly leaving no room for such primitive mysteries. But in the quiet hours, when the wind sighs through the pines of the Adirondacks with a particular resonance, or when a sudden, inexplicable chill descends on a summer evening, the old-timers in the few remaining settlements near the Fawn will sometimes fall silent. They'll exchange a glance, a knowing look that speaks of things felt but never spoken aloud. And if you listen very closely, beneath the rustle of leaves and the cry of a distant loon, you might just catch it, the faintest echo of a low, pervasive hum, a vibration that seems to come not from the air, but from the earth itself, a reminder that the world is stranger and far less explained than science would have us believe. The boy science couldn't explain hadn't been solved. He'd simply stepped out of its equations, leaving behind only the haunting silence of the unanswered question, and the chilling certainty that some forces, some lives, exist forever in the spaces between the known and the unknowable. Timothy Caldwell was gone, but the mystery he embodied, the terrifying, beautiful hum of the inexplicable, lingered on, a ghost in the machine of a rational world, waiting for the next moment the veil might thin.